Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in.
Okay, happy Thursday everybody. Yesterday we discussed Chinese developer Country Garden's devastating first half performance, with profits down an incredible 96%. Unsurprisingly, as we've been following the sharp decline in housing sales this year, other developers, with just a few exceptions, have also seen two very bad quarters. Quote, sweeping reforms aimed to gradually deflate the housing bubble also brought unintended consequences that have led to disruptive deleveraging among developers and a sales slump threatening macroeconomic stability. End quote. And of course, due to the highly interconnected nature of the massive housing sector, this hit to the sector has had flow-on effects for other important industries. For example, on Tuesday, SANY, S-A-N-Y, Heavy Industry Co., one of China's largest construction machinery makers, which services the construction industry, reported a 73% plunge in profits in the first 6 months of 2022, year on year. Revenue fell 41% during the same period. Another major player in the industry, Zoomlion, Z-O-O-M-L-I-O-N, Heavy Industry Science and Technology Co., reported a 50% revenue drop. Quote, excavators are SANY's core product. In the first half, the company's excavator sales declined 35.6% year-on-year to 16.7 billion yuan. Sales of cranes, cement, mixing trucks, and other construction machinery also fell across the board. The struggles of the construction machinery makers are spreading to the upstream supply chain. Jiangsu Hengli Hydraulic Co. Limited said its sales of excavator cylinders declined 33% in the first 6 months. End quote. According to a recent report by Xiangcai Securities, domestic excavator, also known as digger, sales have declined for 14 consecutive months since May 2021. Industry insiders are hoping for some easing in Q3 and Q4 of this year as stimulus and market support measures kick in and stabilize construction activity. We will see. Not every industry is suffering so bad from the housing crisis, however. After 2 years of tough regulatory tribulations, some of China's technology giants may finally be finding their footing again. For example, despite declining revenue, Baidu Inc. is back in the black in Q2 of this year. Baidu reported a net profit of 3.6 billion RMB, about $500 million, much better than the $500 million RMB loss during Q2 of last year. The company attributed its better performance with the success of their cloud businesses, with executives saying that Baidu is investing in AI and autonomous driving as areas for future growth. Other industries which are also doing okay is oil and gas, batteries and new energy sectors, supported by massive government subsidies. Indeed, these industries greatly contributed to China's domestically traded companies. 4,825 companies traded on the Shanghai, Shenzhen and Beijing stock exchanges, posting 3.19% growth in combined profits in the first half of this year. While this is not as great a performance as we have seen in previous years, considering the difficult year it's been for the economy as a whole, positive growth is good news. Though we should note that most of this growth came from Q1, with Q2 profit growth at just 1%. Now moving back to the housing sector for one moment, UK-based Japanese-owned Financial Times reports yesterday that global funds that invested in Evergrande's bonds have come up with their own debt restructuring plan for the developer and demanded that its chairman repay liabilities with his own wealth. Quote, frustrated bondholders submitted a proposal that laid out a framework to restructure Evergrande's $20 billion of offshore debts in recent days after the company missed a self-imposed deadline in July to present a plan to meet its colossal liabilities. End quote. The piece explains that the $300 billion debt-ridden developer had told creditors that it was on track to meet the July deadline. Foreign creditors also proposed that Evergrande's chairman buy new shares issued by the company and use the capital to repay part of its offshore debts. Investors including BlackRock and USB had been Evergrande bondholders when the developer sparked the housing crisis last year, but since then have reduced their holdings. Now, based on Q2 filings, major investors include BlackRock, Ashmore, and Prudential. Okay, let's wrap up part 1 on the economy with some positive news. According to the 2022 Global Asset Management Center Index report published by the China-Europe International Business School, Shanghai has risen 2 slots to become the 6th biggest global hub of asset management this year, and 3rd in Asia, after Singapore and Hong Kong. While this is a positive sign for the city's ambitions to become an international financial hub, further advancement up the list may be difficult for Shanghai, with a high personal income tax, uncompetitive earnings in the financial sector, and a relatively closed border and political system, all acting as barriers to attracting foreign talent. An alternative asset gap is also sizable. In Q1, the combined market cap of Singapore's real estate investment trusts, for example, was almost 17 times that of Shanghai, according to the report. Hey guys, if you enjoyed today's episode of China Update, don't forget to hit the like button. And for anyone who wants to go the extra mile and help keep China Update sustainable, help me continue to produce these episodes for you guys every day, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. Thank you so much, everybody, as always, for the ongoing support. Next up, let's move through a few Taiwan Strait developments. Over the weekend, 2 American warships passed through the Taiwan Strait, the first such action from the U.S. side since U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's trip, which Beijing responded to with unprecedented military drills around the island. The U.S. 7th Fleet sent 2 guided missile cruisers, the first reported transit by 2 American cruisers in 4 years. Quote, "Having a pair of the same class of cruisers during this transit at the same time is rather unprecedented. This appears to reinforce the notion of freedom of transit passage, notwithstanding the PLA drills and Beijing's apparent attempt to change the status quo of the Taiwan Strait median line." End quote. The U.S. Navy, in a statement, expressed the move demonstrates U.S. commitments to a, quote, "free and open Indo-Pacific," end quote. People's Liberation Army Eastern Theater Command, in its own statement, expressed that it monitored the passage and that, quote, "troops of the Theater Command remain on high alert and are ready to thwart any provocation," end quote. Some analysts argue that the U.S. passage sends an important signal to local allies about continued American commitment to the region. Quote, "If the U.S. does not continue to enter the strait, it would show that Beijing's warnings had worked." End quote. Meanwhile, Taiwan has begun targeting mainland Chinese drones flying over its outlying islands for the first time in an effort to block the PLA from demonstrating effective control over nearby waters and airspace, but increasing the risk, commentators warn, of a military accident in the Taiwan Strait. On Tuesday afternoon, local time, soldiers on Kinmen, or Jinmen in Mandarin, a Taiwanese-controlled island just off the mainland city of Xiamen, shot at a Chinese drone. This is the first time that this has occurred and may represent a more forceful change in Taiwan's standard operating procedure. Quote, "According to procedure, we warn, report, try to expel with measures such as flares, and if that fails, we fire shots." End quote. Some analysts believe the drone activity represents grey zone tactics intended to wear down the Taiwanese side. Quote, "While the military threat from small commercially available unarmed drones is relatively minor, Taiwan still needs to find means to deter such activities, lest it set a tactical precedent for larger armed unmanned aerial vehicles entering the country's airspace." End quote. And finally, for today's video, on yesterday, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, just a matter of minutes before her term in the position ended, published a long-awaited official human rights report on Xinjiang. The report expressed, among other things, quote, "The extent of arbitrary and discriminatory detention of members of the Uyghur and other predominantly Muslim groups may constitute international crimes, in particular, crimes against humanity," end quote. That, quote, "allegations of patterns of torture or ill treatment, including forced medical treatment and adverse conditions of detainment, are credible," end quote, and that, quote, "serious human rights violations have been committed," end quote, through government, quote, application of counter-terrorism and counter-extremism strategies, end quote. In response to the UN report, which was provided to China to read in advance, Beijing published its own 131-page document strongly condemning the UN report as, quote, based on disinformation and lies fabricated by anti-China forces, end quote, and expresses, quote, all ethnic groups, including the Uyghurs, are equal members of the Chinese nation. At present, Xinjiang enjoys social stability, economic development, cultural prosperity, and religious harmony, end quote. State media published a series of articles this week too in preparation and anticipation for the UN report, including this one from the state-run Global Times, which expressed, quote, the US's trick is crystal clear: to use its dominant position in the global discourse and its shamelessness in the geopolitical game to smear and attack China on all possible fronts. As the West continues to spread lies, China's efforts to tell its story over Xinjiang-related issues aim at refuting and stopping the spread of disinformation, end quote. The United Nations Human Rights Report has provided renewed energy for a formal UN investigation of the region. However, with China holding significant sway among UN member states, as well as veto power in the Security Council, such an investigation remains very unlikely. That is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. I'll see you tomorrow.